Hey everybody, it's PartyElite, and today we're taking a look at the upcoming real-time strategy game set in the Game of Thrones universe, War for Westeros. Thanks to the developers, I was given early access to a very early demo build of the game to check it out and share my thoughts, and though it was focused around skirmishes with just 2 maps and 2 factions to play as, the Starks and the Lannisters, my time with the build definitely showed some promise. I've been cautiously optimistic about this game since it was first announced, since the Game of Thrones universe is practically begging for a strategy game, and after the prolonged silence since the announcement, I was getting a little worried. Fortunately, I can cast that worry aside now, and I'll explain exactly why and discuss what I'm hoping for at the same time. Feel free to use the timestamps down below to jump around the video, and don't hesitate to let me know your thoughts and any questions you might have in the comments as well. I'll try and answer all that I can, and I'll try and get the answers that I don't yet have. And as you're watching, please do keep in mind that the build I played was a very early work-in-progress version of the game, meaning a lot is subject to change, and you should also know that the footage you're seeing on screen is all B-roll that was provided to us by the developers. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure why they didn't just let us record our own footage, since I didn't run into any particular issues that made me go, okay, they just don't want this being shown. Everything was running very smoothly, but hey, to each their own. Either way, I just wanted to let you know that that was the situation, but without any more time to waste on an introduction now, let's begin. Satisfying combat. Combat in War for Westeros will feel familiar to veterans of the genre, but it's clear that the game is going to take the opportunity presented by its setting to step out of the comfort zone frequently and with style. At its most fundamental level, going over the basics real quick, you'll spend one or both of 2 resources, gold and influence, to recruit units of different types from different buildings that you also build with the use of one or both of those same 2 resources. Access to these buildings and more advanced units is gated through the construction of other prerequisite buildings and the upgrade of your main capital building, which also costs the very same resources to pursue. We'll talk a bit more about the acquisition of said resources in a later section, as that's got some interesting touches too, but now you're caught up on what it takes to actually get access to and recruit any given unit, and yeah, it's fairly standard stuff when compared to any other base building centered RTS. Looking at the units themselves, while some, like heroes and siege engines and giants and mammoth riders and maniacal madmen who throw pots of wildfire all come as single entity units, the vast majority are recruited as squads, which means that as they take damage and individuals die off, they become less effective, and so you'll want to pull them back to a safe area under your control to reinforce them and send them back into the fight. But health isn't the only consideration for these units, as morale plays a significant role too, though a little differently than the norm in these kinds of games. Represented as a separate bar that drains as units get overwhelmed, a unit with its morale depleted doesn't simply break and leave the battlefield, instead just performing worse and worse in any engagement it gets thrown into. This means you need to keep an eye on this, as units don't just automatically pull away when they're in trouble, but it also means that you can use these low morale units to potentially help buy more time for some other action, or to otherwise harass or block the enemy as temporarily as it may be. Now, whether a unit is a single entity or a squad, it has a couple of defining attributes: its type and its role. Type includes classifications like light or heavy infantry, light or heavy cavalry, beast, ranged, so on and so forth, while role indicates things like anti-cavalry, siege, anti-heavy, or anti-light, or anti-infantry in general. As you can tell, that means that there's sort of a typical rock, paper, scissors style mechanic at play here, but it's with more than just 3 designations, making things a bit more interesting and complex. Naturally, this makes scouting essential so that you can prepare your own army to counter whatever it is your enemy is planning, but this also makes battlefield maneuvering particularly important too, ensuring that you're taking on advantageous engagements as frequently as possible. Beyond just that though, the game also takes into account the benefits of flanking and attacking from the rear, at least with specific units, and it further asks you to consider your plan of attack as you navigate choke points and impassable terrain on some pretty interesting map layouts. Combat is generally quite an active matter here, and your ability to micromanage will make a difference, especially when you unlock special abilities for certain units, or when you field heroes that can buff their allies or hamstring enemies with the use of active abilities that they actually unlock over time as they level up. Even outside of combat, you'll actually have a lot of decisions to make. For example, you can choose to apply upgrades to certain unit types through your blacksmith or other upgrade-oriented buildings, but then you can go further and choose specific squad upgrades to influence the performance of individual squads one way or another. Do you, for example, make your infantry more heavy-hitting, or do you make them defend better against enemy arrows? The latter option could be a waste against an enemy who intentionally decides not to bring any archers, but a godsend against one who prioritizes them. But I'll be honest, apart from all the tactical layers and decision-making and interesting units that make combat satisfying for all the right mechanical and systems-oriented reasons here, one of the most satisfying things about it all is just how dynamic combat looks and feels. A cavalry charge sends infantry flying back, a trebuchet lobs shots that fling people around, and a giant can knock people into the air or take a knee and fire its bow from a great distance, and when the green glow of wildfire takes hold, there's a genuine feeling of wonder as people start dying by the droves, catching fire as they fight in fields covered in alchemical concoctions. And when both sides of the battlefield have maxed out their population caps and army sizes, the clashes feel particularly epic. Even if you're watching a mammoth just trundle through half your army with little hesitation, causing you damage, at least it looks good. Both for its tactical depth and cinematic feeling, combat in War for Westeros feels very satisfying, and I'm really looking forward to what else the devs cook up to further push that feeling and even enhance it. I can't wait to bring dragons to the battlefield, for example, but it was great to see how even the beastless factions had unique units that made them feel similarly fun and interesting to play, made them feel interesting to look at and engage with. On which note, let's discuss Asymmetrical Factions. When the game releases, it'll come with 4 major factions from the Game of Thrones setting: the Starks, the Lannisters, the Targaryens, and the White Walkers. The early slice I was able to play focused solely on the first 2 factions, so I can only speculate on the others, but what I feel quite confident in saying is that the devs are doing a very good job in properly differentiating these factions in interesting ways, particularly when it comes to their units, and how they feel in battle, and how they adapt the lore. Naturally, the heroes that are available to the factions set them apart in one way. Lannisters can't field Stark direwolves, or Jon Snow or Robb Stark, just as the Starks can't recruit Jaime or Tywin Lannister into battle. Each of these heroes have their own abilities, gaining access to more as they level up through combat, all in the interest of fulfilling their own purpose on the battlefield. Again, with every hero filling a different kind of role. But the heroes are honestly the smallest part of the equation in my opinion, as cool as they may be. The game is able to represent the vast difference in culture, climate, and resources between the factions through its units, befitting the lore from which it's all derived. The Starks can field members of the Night's Watch, for example, or draw in soldiers from beyond the wall, bringing hordes of free folk or their giants and mammoths to aid in battle. The Lannisters naturally have no such tools at their disposal, but the mercenaries recruited through pay houses bring a variety of options through the use of Lannister gold. Of the 2 factions, only the latter makes proper siege equipment by default, or has access to wildfire, whereas the Starks need to make very specific decisions to gain access to catapults, and have no means of using anything akin to wildfire. I had fun playing as both factions, and to be honest, the first time I booted up as the Lannisters, I wasn't sure how they could possibly compete with the army of giants and mammoth riders that I just fielded as the Starks, but that was before I was flinging wildfire across the battlefield with giant trebuchets standing proudly behind my charging heavy cavalry. Naturally, the factions are visually distinct as well, and they have distinctions outside of combat too. Their buildings are their own, of course, but when it comes to the Starks, they have to, at one point, choose between 2 paths with a building that represents an alliance with one of 2 external parties, the Night's Watch or the Free Folk. This choice will lock or unlock various other buildings as well as units, and can potentially lead to fairly different mid and late game plays, though there is a later upgrade that gives access to the unpicked option for a full roster in the late game if the player wants to invest resources in that way. The Lannisters, meanwhile, are able to spend one of the 2 resources to get access to the other, representing their immense wealth and influence, and they can even rely on a debt mechanic to move more quickly with urgent needs, but a Lannister always repays their debts, so this is something that can bite you in the butt further down the road if mismanaged. These differences can feel quite sizable, and I'll be honest, I was quite worried about this aspect being undercooked until I got hands-on. The factions do, in fact, feel quite different from one another. I would still like to see it pushed further though. For example, both factions rely on a gold-producing building and an influence-producing building. Sure, for the Starks it's a windmill and a weirwood tree, and for the Lannisters it's a gold mine and a lion statue. And while that was fine, it certainly didn't push as far as some of the other ideas. For one, how do you just build a weirwood tree? For two, I understand that windmills can produce gold through the sale of the food that they're producing, but why not just make the food the resource instead? Little things like that can really help set things further apart, and I think that could go a long way. I'm especially curious to see how the Targaryens and White Walkers will be represented too. The latter might be able to raise the dead, the former will likely field Dothraki and Unsullied troops, but will they push further than just their units? And if so, in what ways? I think about Age of Empires 4 a little when I say this, and in particular, the Mongol ability, if I remember it correctly, to just pick up and go, moving their settlement around as they desire because of that faction's real historical, cultural past as a nomadic tribe. I'm not saying that's something the Targaryens, for example, should be able to do exactly, but it is interesting to think of a transient faction like that, one that doesn't necessarily have a permanent home. Or, does it make sense for the White Walkers to have a barracks? That would feel odd, right? Who knows, the devs might already have solutions for these things, and I get the feeling they do just based on everything I've seen with the Starks and the Lannisters, but I am curious to see exactly how it all plays out. I should say, excited to see how it all plays out. It's all speculation for now, but again, everything I've seen so far is very promising, and I hope the devs continue to push even further. They've got some very fun ideas on display already, and this goes beyond combat and the factions actually, right through to the aggressive map designs. Honestly, I didn't know how else to title this section, but hopefully it'll make sense as I explain further. The slice that I got to play had just 2 maps available, both for 1v1 games, but there was just something about them that made them feel particularly forward. First, a bit about how the maps work. Again, something that'll be almost entirely familiar to veterans of the genre. Each map is divided into territories, with one starting territory assigned to each player where their initial base and capital building is situated. Additional territories have little outposts that need to be captured by a faction's military units before granting that territory to said capturing faction, further allowing the capturing faction to build structures within said territory. And of course, territories can go back and forth in terms of control. So, if you want to establish a forward operating base, you'll want to rush over to a distant territory, capture the outpost, and then start building your unit recruitment structures there to provide quick reinforcements closer to the front. But of course, you'll have to prepare to defend it with walls and towers and all that good stuff. But generally, you'll want to expand to these additional territories because of how resource collection works. As mentioned previously, there are 2 main resources, gold and influence. Gold is produced through buildings that you can put down anywhere, but there are specific spots on these captured territories where the yield is significantly higher. What's more, each region has a cap for the gold-producing buildings, and going over that cap results in diminishing returns, which means if you want a steady flow of gold well into the late game, you need to secure these vital expansions quickly, and if you want to get the upper hand early on, you'll need to move even faster. Influence, meanwhile, is primarily generated by buildings that can only be built in very specific locations. So, if you want those advanced units and techs, you really need to make a move on these. What I really like though, at least on one of the maps, was how the structure that needed capturing was actually quite removed from all the resource locations, and though some locations were clearly advantageous for one side of the map over the other, you could still make a break for it, and then secure the resources closer to your own side of the map rather than the other, leaving you exposed if the main structure gets captured by your opponent, but otherwise keeping you somewhat safe from harassment or instant collapse off the back of one strong assault. The maps also seem to have a nice flow to them in how regions were connected between each other, and I also quite like the presence of minor factions on the map, where a couple dwellings would, if given enough room, constantly spawn new assailants, the elimination of whom would grant a small financial reward. Nothing game-changing, but valuable at critical moments to gain or maintain the upper hand. I'm really curious to see how some of the larger maps feel in particular, especially when considering the game modes. The build I had access to focused solely on the multiplayer and skirmish experience, just allowing for a 1v1 setup on 2 different maps, though giving the option of 2 different victory conditions. The full game will add in 2v2 modes as well as a 4-player free-for-all option, as well as, I'm sure, a plethora of additional maps, but the victory conditions will remain the same: annihilation and domination. The former is about eliminating the enemy's capital structure, and the latter is about holding on to more of the territory capture points than the enemy, and in some cases, if I understand correctly, all of the available capture points on the map for a set duration. These both naturally have slightly different flows and feels, and they encourage slightly different kinds of approaches, and you can even enable both victory conditions for a single game, which should be good for keeping players on their toes. But I'll be honest, the game mode that I'm most excited for here is the one we unfortunately did not have access to, and that's the campaign. I am really excited to see how all these battles are contextualized in the greater setting, and I want to see how politics and logistics all come into play. The politicking is what made Game of Thrones particularly special in my eyes, as did the desire to care about and actually represent the economics and logistics of war. If this layer can adequately capture those concepts as you go from region to region, playing the battles as described throughout this video, we'll have an excellent game on our hands. But that's all I've got for now, folks, and time will tell where things end up, but it's off to a promising start at least, with some great visuals, compelling combat mechanics, and a good variety on display, even with just 2 factions on hand. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting that like button and letting me know below in the comments, and for more strategy gaming news, previews, let's plays, and more, you might want to consider subscribing too. Otherwise, as always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big old thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.